Hello. This is Master GRE at Master GRE 2025 on YouTube. We're going to cover the second half of the verbal section in this video. The first half of the verbal section was the vocab, which was done in a previous video. This time around, we're going to cover the passage rules. So this is the passage rules of the GRE. Okay. So I'll go through the rules and then provide various examples over here on the left to try and characterize this stuff and give you some actual examples. So let's start with the first one. Paragraph breaks matter. Okay. So the passages are obviously the second half of the verbal section that focus mainly on stories. But the exam really isn't that long. You know, it's somewhere between 18 or 23 minutes, depending on the section that you have. So you can't really be forced to read too much. So what they're going to give you is usually something like what I have on the left here, a short story that can essentially be broken down into, something less than 15 lines usually, and no more than 2 or 3 questions attached to it. This one's already probably as long as it usually will get. So if the stories are usually really, short, why would there be a paragraph break? Well, that means if there is a paragraph break, because we know the stories are going to be pretty short, it's usually for a reason. We actually see that here, where the passage kind of starts off talking about one concept, and then some indication for us that the story changes and these paragraph breaks matter is that the very first word of the second paragraph is but. It means a contrast, a however, some sort of change. And that actually is pretty consistent throughout this story. So for instance, the paragraph break always introduces some sort of new concept, new idea, maybe a change in perspective or a change in the main idea, but it always involves some sort of new addition or major change to the paragraph. So you want to catch on to that. There's usually going to be some sort of question that they ask about this paragraph break, or maybe even the main idea could be found at that paragraph break. But something important happens here. When you have a story that's pretty short to begin with, you know that's going to occur. That actually happens in this section. So the question number 7 here on this section says, in the second paragraph, the author is primarily concerned with what? So they're already asking something specifically about this paragraph break. And then you'll notice one as you answer the question, that things change, especially with that but telling us that there's going to be some sort of counter that will change our answer. Okay, so that's probably the first thing to keep in mind. Now, diving into this passage a little bit more deeply, I'll introduce the second one, which is if it's a choose 3, usually not all of them. So, in the verbal section, you're going to get something like number 5 here a lot of the time. So it's consider all that apply, consider each answer individually and choose all that apply. So there's only 3 answer choices, but it could be any of them. It could be all of them. It could be just one of them, but it leaves it open-ended for you. So what I recommend doing is first to go into this understanding that it's probably not going to be all 3 of them. Sometimes it will be all 3 of them, but it usually isn't. So you can go in just assuming it's not going to be all 3 of them. If it does end up being all 3 answer choices, it will feel very obviously so. You will have no way to try and make it an individual answer. There's no way to fight against it. It will feel very obvious too. So that's the case where it will be all three of them. But most of the time, how you want to focus on these choose multiples is to find the odd answer out. So the way I describe this is that of the three answers, there is one that will stick out as different from the others. Okay. So in number 5 here, a steady drop in miles, they're trying to say which of these authenticates a decline in driving among young people. And C is talked about. They bring it up right here, where there's a decline in the number of miles driven, end of the massive road building projects, and B also happens. It says here, it's true that it's the end of the massive road building projects. And not only that, they peaked long ago. So B and C are proven to be correct. Okay. Now, A, if we look up here, it says 23%. So most of the time when I give people this question, they think A is correct, but read the fine print here. So in the question, it says 23% decline in car ownership. In the passage, it says a 23% decrease in driving among young people. It's a different statistic. Okay. You should keep that in mind when you're reading. There's just a whole block of words. Kind of gets boring. We kind of gravitate towards these numbers that show up because it's something different. It's a little variety in this massive block of text, but make sure you read the specifics. They might give you the number and you want to skim it and say, well, of course that's going to be right, but the actual statistic they're referring to is different. So the different one here is A. A does not get proven in the passage. B and C do get proven. So you want to pause here before you pick a final answer and remind yourself, okay, A is different, B and C are equivalent to each other. Now, you don't want to immediately jump to picking B and C. That could be the right answer, and in this case, it will be B and C. But before you pick your final answer, you always want to pause and ask yourself something really quick. Was this a not an except or but question? Okay. This seems very trivial, but as you're rushing through this exam, it's very easy to miss if they were asking for the opposite in the question. So this question could have very easily said, which of these is not proven or not authenticated in the story? And then all of a sudden A was wrong, but now it's the right answer because they were asking for the wrong one. And that might seem silly now, but it's one of the more common answers on this exam. Do not forget the not, except, or but questions. They are a very common pitfall. Here, there is no not, except, or but. There is no contrast. They're asking for which of these are correct. So B and C are the noticeable ones for being correct from the story. So our answer would be B and C, and we would leave A. But, if this was the opposite, A would be correct, and then B and C would be wrong. So that's how you handle the choose multiple. Because it's usually not all three of them, I suggest you break it down and find out which singular answer choice is different from the other three, and then find out if that one answer choice is correct or if that one answer choice is wrong based on what the question is asking. Okay. So this is the first set of rules here. I want to add another one. That choose 3 really is one of the trickier ones. And so that's like a harder question type. Not, except, and but are very, I would say, almost like silly mistakes, but you shouldn't really discount silly mistakes like, oh, they're not going to happen for me. That tends to mean that they're a lot more likely for everybody. So I definitely don't think you should look past this. But going back to more specific to the story, in the verbal section, we have direct from the passage slash, stated questions slash, I guess like in parentheses, I can really say what these mean is that it's explicitly mentioned. Okay. explicitly mentioned. So these types of questions are kind of I'm sure if you remember the ACT or the SAT, the undergraduate exams, or if you took an international university exam, this is probably the type of passage reading question you remember. It's the most straightforward. It's the one that's basically just saying, oh, which of these is directly said in the story. We just want you to read the story and find a very particular detail. Okay. So something like number 8 here on this next story is a great example of just choose from the passage. Just read the passage, tell us which one of these statements is true. It's not asking for you to pick out of multiple questions. It's not asking for an inverse. It's not asking for a not, except, or but. It's just, this is the most fundamental. Read the story, tell us which one of these statements is true. So what function might a medication perform to decrease the obesity of a user? This is also a choose multiple. So it could potentially be multiple answers. We'll read through it, but more importantly, this is really just a direct from the passage. They're just telling you, read the passage, tell us which one of these statements is going to be true. So let's see. What would a medication for decreasing obesity use? Like what would that medication entail? Okay. So obesity results when a person consumes significant amounts of calories, or more calories than energy burned over a long period of time. Though at this point, scientists cannot point a single cause of obesity. In a large majority of obesity cases, the causes are related to genetic factors that influence the metabolism of fat and that regulate the hormones and proteins that control appetite. A person's appetite is determined by different processes that occur both in the brain and the digestive system. During digestion, carbohydrates break down into different types of sugar molecules, including glucose. Immediately after eating, blood glucose levels rise, which triggers the release of insulin. So sugar rises in the blood, triggers the release of insulin, a hormone that helps change glucose into energy. So it turns sugar into energy. As the insulin pours into the bloodstream, it pushes the glucose into cells. Insulin is a significant factor in terms of obesity because it helps determine which nutrients will be burned and what will be stored in cells for future use. Recent studies have found that the faster a cell processes insulin, the more fat it stores. Okay, this might be one cause of obesity, though there are many factors to consider. And to date, no theory is determined to be conclusive. Now, this is pretty important because we're talking about what could we actually do to decrease obesity. And so a lot of this is explaining how obesity works and the different processes and how it's fairly complicated to break down. But the only part that actually provides any help is right here. The faster a cell processes insulin, the more fat it stores. So the faster a process happens, the more basically the more insulin, or the more you use insulin, the faster a cell takes in insulin and processes everything. That will cause more storing of fat, perhaps more obesity. So they don't say it's conclusive, but they give us some sort of a hint. So what would a medication form to decrease? So we want to decrease obesity. So if we know more insulin or more processing of insulin causes more fat to be stored, we're looking for the opposite of that, okay? So it can help a user process insulin more quickly. We want to decrease obesity, so we don't want to do this. So A is going to be a wrong answer. B is saying it can cause the user to produce more insulin. If we want to decrease the obesity of a user, recent studies found that if a cell processes insulin, the more fat it stores. We can come back to B. It seems like maybe producing more insulin will cause fat in the cells to maybe get stored more quickly, but we should see. It can slow the rate in which the cells process insulin. Now, C seems very spot on, right? So, A, I think, is completely wrong. B, maybe I'm wavering on that one a little bit. But let's look at C. It says it slows the rate in which cells process insulin. Well, that's an exact opposite of what they told us here. We're looking for that. We want to decrease obesity. So if this causes it to happen, at least in this one study, our only solid answer that seems to fit the description will be C. So this is kind of like that number 5 I showed you up here. It's another case where there's one answer that's very different from the other two, but the other two are wrong. And then C is a correct answer, okay? So C is going to be the right one here. It's the only one that answers how would we decrease obesity. The other two either don't answer the question or potentially will increase it based on these descriptions, okay? But more importantly than the choose 3, this I got directly from reading the story. Unfortunately for me, based on timing for the test, I had to read the whole thing and get all the way to the end to actually get some solid information. But these questions tend to be the most straightforward. If you read carefully, you'll be able to figure out what the answer is going to be. I read the story, I found out, all right, there's only one study that talks about results from obesity. So odds are if there's a medication, it's going to refer to that study. So let me just pick the answer accordingly. It's the most, I would say, boring or straight answer question on the verbal section. So that's a good example right there. Okay. Besides purpose, or direct from the passage, we have maybe a suggest. This is a good idea to bring up suggest questions. So these are hinted at, but not stated. I have found that the hardest part of the passage section for students is not comprehension. Most people who take this exam fully understand how to read, how to comprehend stories. None of this stuff is particularly hard. The biggest complaint I've ever gotten as well is so much of this just sounds like learning lawyerisms. Like there's so much detail in the questions specifically that they sound like they're asking something I don't know how to answer. And, based on these 5 rules so far, you might have even felt that once or twice listening to this. Like, okay, well, this is great, but, each of these seems so varied already. And to me, they sound like the same question. So a big part of the passage rules are just to help you understand when they ask you and they use these key words like suggest, imply, what is the purpose, what is the main idea, what is stated in the passage. Each one of these is actually asking a different question. It might not feel that way, but it actually is. So part of this video is just to help teach you those lawyerisms, teach you that terminology, so it doesn't feel so obtuse to you. So what's an example of suggest? Let's look it up. So that's over here. I've got another story ready to talk about what the author suggests about Cassatt's work. So this is a story on the artist Mary Cassatt. And we're going to go through it. I'll read the story, and we'll talk about what the author suggests. So Cassatt is noteworthy for being one of the few women artists to succeed professionally during the 19th century. Because of her friendship with Edgar Degas, she was the only American to take part in an 1879 exhibit on French Impressionist artists in Paris. Though Cassatt's style was influenced by Impressionism, she developed her own unique style and subject matter. It is easy to see the influence of Degas in her paintings, but her interest in Japanese print is also reflected in many of her paintings. So it says this directly. We'll come back to that. Much of her earliest work portrays women engaging in home activities such as reading, sewing, or writing letters. After the French exhibition, Cassatt began to explore what she eventually became famous for, painting of women and children. It is through these paintings that Cassatt highlights the often overlooked role of painting of women as mothers. Okay. So let's go over to what the author suggested. So, that she was utterly original. Well, utterly means absolute, or very, emphasized original. I mean, maybe she is. I mean, at least her subject matter is, and we'll come back to that. But, it's easy to see her influences from Degas and Japanese print. So maybe she's not utterly original. She depicts uncommon feats. It's quite the opposite, actually. Kind of focused on everyday activities and, women taking care of children. Was politically motivated? Certainly not that. Maybe there, in retrospect, were political tones to it, but certainly not during the time. Again, she focused on the women taking care of children or women as mothers. Now, here are the two answers that I really want to boil down to. So E is saying was influenced by Edgar Degas. Most people pick this for this answer. Most people, I would say on number 7 that I've ever taught, pick E. They say, well, it shows up right here. It's easy to see the influence of Degas on her paintings. That would be the answer, right? Wrong. This is not an author stated question. If we're asking to state something directly, then we would pick E. In this one, we're talking about things that are hinted at. Maybe it never says things words for word, but it's the general vibe of what's going on in the story. So what's the actual vibe? Well, this is stated directly. And in fact, her influence being Degas in Japanese print is a direct answer question to number 6. 6 is asking, select the sentence directly from the passage that answers this question. And that's going to be B, which is a stated question. It's stated directly in the story, so we do not want to put that for number 7. What we want to put for number 7 is going to be D. She focused on everyday activities. Never once does it directly state that, she focused on everyday activities, but saying that, she's a mother and she focused on these things, and they focused on at least women taking care of children, and maybe she focused on mothers. That is the indication that, it might not have been said directly she's focusing on normal activities, but that is the answer, okay? That's the answer. So it's not going to be E. E would be an answer to something like number 4, rule number 4, okay? But number 5 here, if you see the word suggested, do not pick what is stated verbatim. Do not pick that. Pick the answer that is closer to a vibe or a general principle or thought that is occurring throughout the passage, but not said directly. I really want to clarify that one, because that's one of the harder ones for students. So that's a suggested example. It's not going to be E. They already say that to us. So that's just stated directly. There's nothing hinted or suggested there. So D is going to be the answer. Number 6 is what I think is like the weirdest question on the entire verbal section. It's an imply/infer question. So imply and infer is a very unique beast. Let me get to it over here. Yeah, here's a great example. So an imply and infer is a very unique beast. It's the type of question that, personally, I got wrong every single time until I did this question in particular, because it's asking for something very unique on this test. So it tends to be the most obvious answer. Most obvious choice that is never stated or never said. I almost joke to everyone I teach that this is like the duh answer. So it doesn't matter how silly the answer sounds. Honestly, the sillier the better, because if it sounds super obvious, that's the right answer. Okay? So let's try out number 20 here. This is an imply and infer question. If it says either imply or infer, you know it's this style of question. So let's try it. The host always goes to the front of the hall and shakes hands with everyone who arrives. This is just a story on etiquette from, I imagine, a while ago. He asks the guests if they want to be shown to the room, and if not, sees that the gentlemen who come without valets give their keys to the butler or footman, and the ladies without maids give theirs to the maids on duty for the purpose. Should any of them feel dusty or otherwise untidy, they naturally ask if they might be shown to their rooms to make themselves more presentable. They should not, however, linger longer than is necessary, as their hostess may become uneasy with their delay. Ladies do not, in fashionable houses, make their first appearance without a hat. Gentlemen, needless to say, leave theirs in the hall when they come in. Okay. Which of these is the most obvious duh-sounding answer? The most clearly, well, this has got to be true. Most people pick A, because they say household staff is essential for greeting guests. Well, maids and butlers and footmen really show up at the beginning of the story, so that's the answer everybody picks. It's the answer I picked as well. But if you look closely, it says that gentlemen who come without valets give theirs to the butler or footman, and ladies without their own maids give theirs to the maid on duty for this purpose. So when you're a host, Is it essential for household staff to receive guests? Not necessarily, not if they come with their own help or their own butlers or their own maids. So this isn't necessarily true. We want an answer that is so obviously correct it feels like duh. So is a valet responsible for greeting guests? No, the host always greets them in the front of the hall, so that's not going to be right. Guests should amuse themselves upon arrival. Well, no, the host is greeting them, and then over here it says the guests, they, should not, however, linger longer than is necessary. Otherwise, the hostess may become uneasy with their delay. So they should get moving. Say hi, hello, but, get ready to relax or go up to your room. So they shouldn't amuse themselves. People should be there to greet them. Untidy guests should feel ashamed of themselves. It says no, they naturally ask if they can be shown to their rooms to make themselves more presentable. After a long journey, you just want a little privacy to get ready. Nothing to be ashamed of there. So it's not going to be D. Everyone should wear a hat while visiting? Seems a bit weird, right? But let's read. Ladies do not, in fashionable houses, make their first appearance without a hat. Gentlemen, needless to say, leave theirs in the hall when they come in. The answer is E. The answer is going to be E. Okay. This is what I mean by the duh answer. Sometimes the answer sounds so stupid. It's like that can't possibly be the right answer, but that is going to be the answer. Until I took this question, I got every single imply and infer I ever did on the GRE wrong. Then when I did this question, the first thing I did was cross E off, and then I eventually got to A. And when I saw the final answer, I was so livid. What I realized, but after being a bit emotional for a minute, what I realized is, oh no, this is a good thing. Because I'm so wrong about number 20. It's not that the question is hard, it's that I completely misunderstand what I'm supposed to answer here. So on something like number 20, this imply and infer, what I realized is that I'm looking at it from a completely different angle. I'm trying to answer it like what is the author's main idea, or which one of these is stated in the story, or what's suggested or hinted at by the author, or something bigger than it is. But imply and infer is always going to be the answer that is so obviously true that it feels like, well, this is just stupid true. So this is the one question you should never overcomplicate, okay? It's a very unique beast. A lot of the passage section, you're going to be trying to overcomplicate and analyzing stories and all of that. Do not do that with imply and infer. It is the most straightforward, obvious answer, okay? So that's the best example I can come up with here. There is not a single book I've ever found that describes how to do imply and infer well. This took a lot of banging my head against a brick wall to find this to be the best explanation of how you answer this question. I found one practice exam with a handwritten solution by another tutor 5 years ago that made a passing comment on imply and infer that said something kind of close to this that I thought was a good representation of how imply and infer works. But even the official guides by ETS really don't do a good assessment of how you're supposed to answer this particular question. So hopefully, if anyone has been doing these questions and wondered how they're supposed to approach imply and infer, this is a good guide, or this is a good rule to follow. Okay, I hope it helps, because it certainly helped me. I gotta say, before I learned this rule, I got every single imply and infer wrong. It was my worst question. Afterwards, I got every single imply and infer correct. So it's very helpful. Okay. After this, it gets a bit more straightforward. So purpose, primary, concern, author's opinion. If you've ever seen these, this is just equal to the main idea. Okay. Now, along with that, let me explain the main idea. The main idea is usually general, basic, informative, broad is very important, And usually the first or last sentence. Okay. Main idea, general, basic, informative, broad, usually the first or last sentence. So main idea compared to imply and infer is a lot more straightforward. This, along with the, directly stated up here, are probably the ones that you're most familiar with, or if you haven't even studied for the GRE yet, you're kind of familiar with what this question is going to ask. A main idea usually just means pick the broadest answer possible, something that summarizes the entire passage. So we'll come back to that in a second. I want to provide, this example right here. So this is a very hard story. I actually wanted to provide this as a main idea question because it's fairly complicated. And I want to show you how most of the GRE does this really good, thing of like smoke and mirrors to try and tell you, oh, the test is a lot harder than it is. So when you're looking at primary purpose of the passage, do not look at the answer choices first. Just go to the story, read it, and remember, get the broad idea of what's happening here. So I'm going to come up with my own answer, and then I'll go down to the question's actual answer choices. So this is from some sort of publication from 2001. In 1998, scientists used the neutrino detector in Kamioka, Japan, so fantastic. If you're not a sciencey person, this is already off to a great start. We're able to observe several thousand neutrinos, elusive tiny subatomic particles, moving at nearly the speed of light and passing through almost everything in their path. The Kamioka findings have potentially far-reaching ramifications. Okay, so we're talking about whatever studies they did in this one place in Japan and how they have a lot of consequences. So the study has a lot of impact. They strongly suggest that the neutrino has mass, albeit an infinitesimal amount. Even a tiny mass means that neutrinos would outweigh all of the universe's visible matter, including because of their vast numbers. Okay, so they have mass, they exist, and they'd weigh more than the rest of the universe combined. So that's cool. Again, to me, to you while you're reading this, you might be like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Remember, this is a main idea question. So you just want to say, okay, so we have more findings, we have more results from this study. That's all that's important. The findings also suggest that a given neutrino does not have one stable mass or one stable identity. Instead, it oscillates from one identity or flavor, physicists' term describing how neutrinos interact with other particles, to another. They oscillate. This oscillation may explain why, although the sun is a large source of neutrinos, detectors capture far fewer solar neutrinos than the best theory of solar physics predicts. So the neutrinos may change in flavors undetectable by detectors. Okay. So all this is telling me is that I guess neutrinos, whatever this particle is in physics, also has like moods or flavor. It can change in the way it exists. It has different forms. So maybe it's hard to detect, at least in the sun. Finally, while the standard particle physics model, so this is a standard theory, which describes all matter in terms of 12 fundamental particles and 4 fundamental forces, does not allow the neutrinos with mass, there are theories that do. Further experiments to confirm the neutrinos have mass could help physicists determine which, if any, of these theories is correct. Awesome. So that's a mouthful. I don't know about you, but my eyes glaze over while reading this, and I've actually studied this stuff in a university setting, so I can't imagine if, you're someone trying to go to business school or just going through like PT or PA, like school, or, you've worked in communications or writing over the last several years, either in school or post-grad. You read this and you're like, God, what am I supposed to get out of this? Like, it's clearly overwhelming, and that's on purpose. It's okay. They do this on purpose. They're trying to mess with you. So don't take it too personally. It's not a you thing. They're trying to give you a story that's super overwhelming. But, this is just asking what the main idea of the story is. To me, it just sounds like they did this study in Japan, and it gave a lot of different results that are really intriguing. There's going to be a lot of ramifications. They still need to do some studying in the future. It's not absolute, but it's a lot of intriguing results. So let's see. It evaluates the merits of a particular theory. It doesn't evaluate anything. It's just explaining. Discusses scientists' inability to account. Nope. It's just talking about this one test that happened in Japan and all the results that came out of it. Point out certain shortcomings of a long-standing theory. Now, they do this in the story, but I'm going to come back to why C is wrong. But they do say how, standard theory says that neutrinos cannot have mass, but we found out they do. So C is a correct statement, but we'll see why it's wrong in a little bit. Compare several alternative explanations for a particular phenomenon. This does not occur. Consider some implications for a certain scientific finding. Bingo. It's going to be E. Absolutely. That's a main idea, right? Just talking about the implications, the results of a certain scientific finding. That's perfect. We don't need to overthink it. Now, why is C wrong? Because C is a correct statement that does not answer the question. I want to say that again, because that's one of the hardest things for people to comprehend on this test, and it's one of the trickiest things about the passage section. C is a correct statement based on the story, but it does not answer the question, saying what is the main idea. The main idea, consider some implications of certain scientific findings, is a better representation of the entire story. C is an answer to a different question, not the one we're working on. And when you're really tired and you're 2 hours into this exam and this is the last question you have to do and you're just sitting there like, oh my God, I want to leave. I just want lunch. I woke up early for this. Now I'm tired. I just want to get past this question. I know I read C somewhere in the story, so I'm going to pick that. No. The passage main idea has to be super broad, super general. The way I say it to people is if it is a tagline for a film poster or the synopsis that you would read for like a movie that's very broad, very general, that's a main idea. Not something super detailed. This is not the way to answer a main idea. That's something you should do to answer like a direct from the passage, but not the purpose of a story, okay? So 12 is going to be number E. And I did this with a really hard story on purpose, just to show you that no matter how difficult it gets, do not overthink the question itself. And it's okay to dumb stories down. I wanted to give this as an example to show you how stories can get very complicated, but it's very easy to kind of simplify them, especially if they're asking for the main idea, okay? So we're mostly through the rules right now. Really, the only ones left I can think of are, if here's number 9. If there's a word online, like on line insert number, the example of this would be like this. What is the context that the word shades on line 2 appears? We've probably all seen this. It's a fairly straightforward question, but I want to clarify something about it. So the way you solve this is define the word clearly, but read the full context. What I mean by that is try and read the entire passage, or at least the full sentence or two after the word, to get an idea of what that definition is going to be. So let's try it out with number 24 here. So it says, in the context in which it appears, shades on line 2 means what? So a lot of people make the mistake when they're rushing. Well, shades sounds like, shade of a tree or something, so maybe it's like coverings. Shades, or like a shade of a hat, maybe it's coverings or something like that. So I probably pick D. You don't want to do that. You want to read the context, right? So let's go over here. The more definitions a given noun has, the more valuable is each one. Okay. Multiple definitions, each subtly different than all the others, convey multiple shades of a meaning. Okay, so most nouns, most words have multiple definitions and they convey multiple shades of meanings. So shades here sounds like different details or different types of definitions, a variety, a multitude, something like that. So is it a reminder? No. Is it obscurities? No. Is it coverings? No. Is it degrees? Maybe, but is it nuances or details or subtleties? Absolutely. So it's going to be B, right? Right answer should always feel like the most obvious one. You don't want to overthink things. So this one's going to be B as in boy. That's how you handle passage vocab, okay? Now the last thing I can think of that I want to cover are the hardest, technically the hardest questions on the exam, and those are weaken the author's argument, you'll notice that's not exactly what I have on the left, but that's for a reason. So weaken the author's argument. This is actually a two-step question. So if you're going to hurt the author, you need to, one, define the argument. You know, if you're gonna hurt someone's argument, it's good to know what the argument is first, right? So really, a weaken the author's argument question is it's a lot harder because it's two questions in one. You already need to do a main idea question, solve it on your own, and then two, pick the opposite answer. Because you want to hurt the main idea. So something that undermines the main idea. Now that's a really hard question. Now I have a caveat over here. Now these are pretty tough. The hardest is when you see this word. This is when things get really dicey, because weaken the author's argument is a two-step process. What's the main idea? Okay, cool. So the main idea is this. I'm just going to pick the opposite of that for weaken the author's argument. Strengthen the author's argument is a whole different level. This is the only question on the entire exam that asks you to add new information to the story to make someone's argument better. So the reason this question is so much harder than weaken the author's argument is because weaken the author's argument isn't asking you to like add too much to the story. It's just saying which of these arguments, which of these answer choices hurts the author's current main idea. Strengthen the author's argument is so much harder because you need to agree with the author, and then every answer choice is going to be like a new sentence that you want to add to the story to help them. So it's exceedingly more difficult to ask you to come up with new information outside of the story's scope to help make the author stronger, okay? So this is a very notorious Power Prep ETS exam question that most people absolutely despise, and I'm going to try and finish off by explaining how this question works, okay? So it's saying, which of the following, if true, strengthens the author's argument? So let's go through it. This is the infamous dolphin question. If any of you have seen it before, then you know it lives in people's nightmares. So recently, an unusually high number of dolphins have been found dead of infectious diseases, and most of these have abnormally high tissue concentrations of a certain compound that even in low concentrations reduces dolphins' resistance to infections. So there's a compound that's really high that even in small amounts hurts them. The only source of these compounds in dolphins' environments is boat paint. The only place this comes from is boat paint. Therefore, since dolphins rid their bodies of the compound rapidly, once exposure ceases, their mortality rate should decline rapidly if the boat paint is banned. All right, so what's the author's argument? Dolphins are dying. The reason they're dying is because of boat paint. So if we get rid of the boat paint, the dolphins can, even though they get hurt very quickly, they fix it themselves very quickly as well. Once they're rid of it, they rapidly help themselves. They get rid of it, and then they're able to heal basically very quickly. So we want to pick an answer that is something new. That is the key word here. It is new to the argument that helps the author even more. So the level of compounds typically used in boat paint today are lower than they were. This would hurt the author, right? Because if we're saying there's lower boat paint today, then that would not help them. Because then it's saying, well, you know, there's already less boat paint. So maybe the problem's already solving itself. So maybe it's not the boat paint. No, you don't want to pick that. In high concentrations, the compounds are toxic to many types of marine animals. This, I would say, is about 95% of what people pick as an answer. And it's wrong. You know why that's wrong? It sounds really good, doesn't it? They already have said this. It's the whole point of this passage. So if you say B, you're just telling us already what we know. It's already bad, right? I just told you, this compound's really toxic. And then if you just told me, well, it's also really toxic, I would go, I already know that. So that's not going to strengthen the author's argument. It's just reiterating what they've already said. Most people pick B. Now, let's move on to the most infuriating answer choice, the one everyone hates. It's C. The compound breaks down into harmless substances after a few months of exposure. So the most important part of the statement is after a few months of exposure. Now, how could this possibly be a right answer? It's saying that, after it's exposed for a while, it breaks down and it's no longer dangerous. So that sounds like it would hurt the author's argument. But what is the author saying? The author is saying that their mortality should decline rapidly if you ban this. This is what you want to latch on to. If we ban the boat paint, of course it's going to help, right? But they're not just saying that. They're going to say, not only are we fixing the problem, it's going to happen quick. Well, if we ban this boat paint, right? If they say, oh, it's terrible right now, but if you give it a couple months, it'll dissolve and then become harmless. This actually really helps the author. It's saying, sure, right now it's terrible, but give it a few months, and if we ban this stuff, it'll disappear instantly. It'll disappear very quickly. So the right answer here is actually going to be C, because it's the only answer that adds extra information to what the author is trying to argue, okay? And C is really hard, because I got to admit, the first time I did this, I did not pick that. I picked B as well. But C is the right answer because it's new information that when you think about what the author wants, they want to solve this problem, and it's going to happen quick. C is the only answer here that says, we are actually going to solve this problem very quickly. All the boat paint is really fresh right now. So if we ban it, it's going to be a problem for a little bit, but then it'll eventually go away. What if instead of, if this is still confusing for you, let me just say this. If C wasn't right, what if we said, oh, this compound never dissolves and it's terrible forever? All of a sudden I would say, well, now forget banning the boat paint. The dolphins are just screwed. They're dead. There's no way of saving them, right? So that's a good way of thinking about it. So we want them to dissolve into harmless stuff because then that helps the author say that this will be fixed very quickly. The decline in mortality will go away very fast. Okay. These are extremely difficult questions. The hardest, I would say. So please be patient with yourselves. Some of this is going to take practice, but ultimately, I wanted to give a decent guide to show students exactly how to handle the passage section of the GRE. You can see that here. Here are all 10-ish rules or so. I'll even put over here in added detail, strengthen the argument even harder. Harder than weaken. Just to remind you, this is the toughest kind. But this is a good guide to basically describe the entire passage section. There might be like one or two clarifications. For instance, there's back over here, I believe like bolded questions. So I'll show you those really quick. Where, I think back over here. For instance, when we saw this for a brief second, when they ask you, about bolded or highlighted sections, they're just saying, what does this sentence do for the passage? That'd probably be like rule number 11 real quick. So from here to here, bolded passages or bolded sentences. The way you solve these is fairly straightforward. Just come up with your own answer first. because the answer choices are going to feel very similar. So if you define this sentence for yourself first, it gets rid of a lot of the haze and smoke going on in these answer choices. Be patient with yourself. Take your time when practicing this stuff. If you're worried about timing on the passages, I'll say this. Extra time on the passages will always help you. I said this in the last video on vocab. Extra time on vocab is not necessarily going to help you. If I gave someone 2 minutes for a vocab question versus 10 minutes, it's not going to make a difference. But if I give you 2 minutes for a passage versus 10 minutes, it will make all of the difference. So if you're someone who's worried about verbal timing right now, don't be. Just learn these rules, understand context, try and comprehend what this section is asking and the minute details of each question. And then once you've figured that out, you can worry about timing. But first, I would really recommend figure out what each of these questions is asking, normalize that for yourself, get confident that when you see imply and infer, you know that's different from author stated, which is different from suggested, which is different from primary purpose, which is different from choose three, which is different from weaken the author's argument, okay? There's a lot going on here. It's not your fault for not knowing, their specific way of answering this test, but hopefully this will be a nice guide for you to figure out exactly how to answer the passages. This ended up being a longer video, but I really wanted to give like a one-stop shop so that moving forward, if you had any concerns or any worries about how to handle the passage section, this really defines it all. So again, this is Master GRE. You can reach me at mastergre2025@gmail.com. I'm also at mastergre2025 on YouTube. Like and subscribe if you like. And I hope, this video is able to help you and really clarify a lot of this stuff. I really do. And I know the passages and the vocab can be super infuriating, but I hope these last few videos end up providing some relief. And take care.